I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Hazelbrook Manor, where Lady Ashworth's annual summer fete was in full swing. The air, usually thick with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, now also carried the lively chatter of villagers, the clinking of teacups, and the faint, off-key melodies of the local brass band. Miss Marple, a delicate wisp of a woman in a sensible tweed skirt and a hand-knitted shawl, sat quietly on a wrought-iron bench beneath a particularly flamboyant rhododendron, observing the scene with her usual keen yet gentle attention. Her gaze, seemingly idly drifting from the vicar fussing over the prize-winning dahlias to young Mr. Finch making rather too ardent conversation with the new schoolmistress, missed very little. She noted the slight tension in Mrs. Henderson's smile as she offered lemon drizzle cake, the way Dr. Albright kept glancing at his watch, and the almost imperceptible air of self-importance around Mr. Ponsonby, the village solicitor, as he held court near the punch bowl. The focal point of the afternoon's entertainment was to be the unveiling of the Hazelbrook Historical Album, a collection of photographs and anecdotes painstakingly compiled by Lady Ashworth herself, detailing the village's past. A small crowd had gathered around a velvet-draped easel, awaiting the grand reveal. Lady Ashworth, a woman of formidable presence despite her advanced years, stood beside it, a triumphant glint in her eye. "And now, my dear friends," she announced, her voice surprisingly robust, "the moment we've all been waiting for, the culmination of months of diligent work, bringing to life the rich tapestry of Hazelbrook's heritage." With a flourish, she pulled back the velvet cloth. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, followed by an immediate stunned silence. It wasn't the album itself that drew their breath, but what lay propped against it, a silver-framed photograph, undeniably old, depicting a young woman with a striking resemblance to Lady Ashworth in her youth. And pinned to the photograph, with a rusty hat-pin, was a single withered black rose. Lady Ashworth herself stared, her face draining of colour. What is the meaning of this?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Her hand, trembling, reached out to touch the photograph, then recoiled as if burned. Before anyone could properly react, a piercing scream tore through the polite hum of the fete. It came from the direction of the old summer-house, half hidden by overgrown clematis. Dr. Albright, who had been nearest, was the first to reach it. He emerged moments later, his face ashen, clutching at the doorframe. "Good heavens," he stammered, his usual professional composure shattered. It's poor Mr. Ponsonby. He's dead." The vibrant garden party, moments before a picture of idyllic English charm, was plunged into a sudden, chilling tableau of shock and burgeoning terror. The brass band faltered, then stopped. The clinking teacups fell silent. Miss Marple, from her quiet corner, merely adjusted her shawl and watched, her blue eyes, though mild, missing absolutely nothing. The summer fete had just become the stage for a most unwelcome drama. The transition from festive cheer to frozen horror was instantaneous. Within the gardens of Hazelbrook Manor, the air seemed to thin, leaving the villagers gasping as if the oxygen had been sucked out by the sheer impossibility of the event. The brass band stood with instruments halfway to their lips, a discordant silence hanging over the lawn. Dr. Albright remained by the summer-house door, his medical bag, usually a symbol of comfort, clutched like a useless weight against his side. The suddenness of Mr. Ponsonby's demise, coupled with the macabre display of the black rose, felt less like an accident and more like a carefully orchestrated performance. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer than the rest, her knitting needles stilled in her lap. She observed the way the crowd splintered. Some moved instinctively toward the summer-house, driven by a morbid curiosity, while others recoiled toward the safety of the tea marquee. She noted that young Mr. Finch did not rush to help, but instead stood remarkably still, his eyes fixed not on the summer-house, but on Lady Ashworth's reaction. Lady Ashworth herself had not moved from the easel. She looked like a marble statue of some ancient, grieving queen, her eyes still locked on that silver-framed photograph and the withered rose pinned through her own likeness. The murmur began at the edges of the lawn and swept inward like a rising tide. It was the sound of a village processing the unthinkable through the medium of speculation. Mrs. Henderson, still holding a silver cake server, turned to the vicar's wife with a trembling lip. She whispered loudly enough for Miss Marple to hear that it must have been a heart attack, brought on by the excitement of the album's unveiling. After all, Mr. Ponsonby was a certain age, and had always been fond of the heavier sport at the club. But the vicar's wife shook her head, her eyes wide with a different kind of fear. She pointed a gloved finger toward the easel, reminding Mrs. Henderson of the black rose. In Hazelbrook law, a black rose was never a symbol of natural causes. It was a token of a grievance long held and finally paid. The gossip sharpened as the shock wore off. Behind the rhododendrons, the schoolmistress was overheard suggesting that Ponsonby had many enemies, being a solicitor who knew where every family's metaphorical skeletons were buried. Every disgruntled heir and every person who had lost a boundary dispute in the last 30 years became a potential suspect in the span of 5 minutes. The theory of the family album curse began to take shape almost instantly. It was a convenient explanation, one that draped the sordid reality of murder in the more palatable cloth of local legend. People preferred to believe in a curse rather than accept that one of their neighbours had crept into the summer house with lethal intent. Miss Marple finally rose, smoothing her skirt with a rhythmic, calming motion. She began drifting through clusters of people, a shadow in lavender silk. She did not join the speculation, but she gathered the fragments of it like stray threads for a tapestry. She heard the gardener complaining to a kitchen maid that the summer-house door had been oiled just that morning and shouldn't have creaked, yet no one had heard it open. She heard the postman mention that Mr. Ponsonby had seemed uncommonly jumpy when receiving his mail for the past week, looking over his shoulder as if expecting a ghost. As she neared the easel, Miss Marple peered over her spectacles at the photograph. It was indeed a younger Lady Ashworth, but there was a scribbled date on the back, visible where the frame had warped slightly, 1952. That was the year of the Great Frost, a time Miss Marple remembered well for its bitterness, and a particular scandal involving the local timber mill. She noticed that the hat-pin used to pierce the photo was of an old-fashioned jet variety, the kind rarely seen since the Great War, suggesting it had been pulled from an attic trunk rather than a modern sewing kit. The arrival of the local constable, a man named Slack who lived up to his name only in his lack of imagination, did little to quiet the rumours. He blustered through the gates, demanding everyone stay where they were, while simultaneously failing to prevent the trampling of the grass near the crime scene. He looked at the body of Mr. Ponsonby, sprawled across a wicker chair with a glass of lemonade still clutched in a rigid hand, and declared it a tragic stroke of nature. He dismissed the black rose as a tasteless prank by village youths. Miss Marple, standing right behind him, gave a small, thoughtful cough. She knew that youths rarely had the patience for historical accuracy in their pranks, nor would they have access to Lady Ashworth's private family photographs. As the sun dipped lower, casting the village into a bruised purple twilight, Miss Marple realized that the peace of Hazelbrook had not been broken by a curse, but by a very human hand, one that was likely currently holding a teacup and trembling just a fraction too much. The following morning, Hazelbrook was draped in a thick, low-hanging mist that seemed to muffle the sounds of the waking village. To the casual observer, the quiet streets suggested a town in mourning, but Miss Marple, peering through her morning-room window while she wound a fresh skein of wool, knew better. The silence was not one of grief, but of intense, focused observation. In every cottage and behind every lace curtain, eyes were watching to see who would be the first to call at the manor, and who would be the first to be summoned by the police. Inspector Slack had already established a temporary headquarters in the village hall, and the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and official self-importance. Miss Marple decided some shopping was needed. One cannot properly understand a mystery without bread for the birds and a fresh tin of Pecco tea. As she walked toward the village square, she observed the subtle shifts in social alignment that always followed a tragedy. She saw Mrs. Henderson talking with the postman, their heads bowing together in a way that suggested they were comparing notes on Mr. Ponsonby's recent correspondence. The solicitor's death had acted as a catalyst, pulling the protective layer off the village's private lives. Miss Marple paused near the chemist's shop, ostensibly to admire the display of lavender water, but in reality she was watching Dr. Albright emerge from his surgery. The doctor looked haggard, his collar slightly askew, and he nearly collided with the vicar. The conversation between the two men was brief but telling. The vicar spoke of a terrible tragedy, his voice booming with a forced pastoral comfort. But Dr. Albright's response was clipped and defensive. He mentioned the autopsy report, with a sharp flick of his hand, indicating a desire to be elsewhere. Miss Marple noted that the doctor's hands were steady, yet he avoided looking the vicar in the eye. It reminded her very much of old Mr. Bedwell, who had once accidentally overcharged the parish fund and spent the next 3 months staring exclusively at people's shoes. It wasn't necessarily guilt of murder, she mused, but it was certainly the behavior of a man burdened by a very specific secret. By the time she reached the village hall, she found Inspector Slack pacing the floor, looking thoroughly exasperated. He saw Miss Marple and offered a curt, dismissive nod. To Slack, Miss Marple was simply a dithering elderly lady with too much time on her hands, a perception she found immensely useful. She took a seat on a wooden bench near the door, opening her knitting bag and settling in as if she were waiting for a bus. Slack was busy interrogating the gardener, a man named George who had worked at the manor for 40 years. George was adamant the summer house had been empty 10 minutes before the body was found. He had been clipping the hedges nearby and would have seen anyone approaching the door. This was the pattern Miss Marple had been looking for. If George was telling the truth, and he was a man of such rigid habit that lying would have required more imagination than he possessed, then the killer had not entered through the door. She thought back to the summer house's structure. It sat against the old stone wall that bordered the woods, and one of the latticed windows at the rear had been broken and covered with ivy for years. It was a detail the police had ignored, focusing instead on the lemonade glass and the visible entry points. Miss Marple's mind turned to the family album curse and the black rose. The rose had been pinned with a jet hat pin. Jet was a mourning stone, popular in the Victorian era, but it was also a specialty of a small jeweller's shop in the neighbouring town that had closed its doors in the late 50s. As Slack dismissed the gardener and began barking orders to a subordinate about checking Mr. Ponsonby's bank records, Miss Marple noticed something else. A small, muddy footprint had been tracked onto the linoleum of the hall, likely by one of the witnesses from the previous day. It was small, narrow, and had a distinctive wear pattern on the inner heel. It wasn't the boot of a gardener or the sturdy brogue of a doctor. It was a lady's shoe, and a rather expensive one at that. She cross-referenced this in her mind with the guests at the fete. Lady Ashworth's daughter, Eleanor, had been wearing such shoes, as had the schoolmistress, though hers were a cheaper imitation. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically as she synthesized these fragments. The solicitor had been jumpy, a vintage photograph had been used as a threat, a black rose had signalled a debt, and a secret entrance had likely been used to bypass the gardener's watchful eye. It was like the time the churchwarden's cat had gone missing. Everyone looked in the trees, but the answer lay in the cellar where the cream was kept. The village saw a curse or a random stroke of fate, but Miss Marple saw a very deliberate sequence of human choices. She rose quietly, her knitting finished for the moment, and slipped out of the hall unnoticed. She had a sudden, urgent desire to look at the parish records from 1952, specifically the entries regarding the timber mill fire. The atmosphere in Hazelbrook shifted from uneasy speculation to a sharp, pointed focus by the following afternoon. Inspector Slack, a man who preferred a tidy solution over a complex truth, had spent the morning storming through the village in his small, rattling car. By 2 o'clock he had found his man. The news travelled through the local shops with the speed of a summer gale. Arthur Finch, the young man Miss Marple had observed behaving with such peculiar stillness at the fete, had been taken into custody for questioning. It appeared that a search of the small cottage he rented on the edge of the manor grounds had yielded a discovery that Slack considered a smoking gun. Beneath a loose floorboard in the scullery, the police had found a small locked wooden box containing several pieces of antique jewellery and, most damningly, a second silver-framed photograph of Lady Ashworth, identical to the one left at the crime scene. The village's reaction was one of collective relief mixed with a sense of "I told you so." Mrs. Henderson, holding court outside the post office, declared that she had always found Mr. Finch's eyes a bit too close together for her liking. It was widely recalled that Finch had been seen arguing with Mr. Ponsonby only a week prior regarding the lease of his cottage. The motive seemed textbook to the police. A desperate young man, perhaps being squeezed for money or facing eviction, had resorted to blackmail using items stolen from the manor, and when the solicitor threatened to expose him, Finch had struck. The curse was now dismissed as a theatrical flourish by a panicked criminal trying to confuse the trail. Miss Marple, however, remained profoundly unconvinced. She spent the better part of the afternoon in her garden, seemingly preoccupied with a stubborn patch of groundsel, but her mind was far from the weeds. She thought of Arthur Finch. He was a somewhat romantic, perhaps slightly foolish young man, but he lacked the cold, calculated precision required to pin a jet hat pin through a photograph at a public event without being seen. Moreover, Arthur Finch was a creature of the present. He'd only moved to Hazelbrook 2 years ago. The jet pin, the vintage photograph, and the references to 1952 were steeped in a past he simply did not possess. To Miss Marple, the evidence against him felt far too convenient, like a parcel wrapped too neatly for the post. She was interrupted in her reflections by a visit from the vicar, who looked remarkably troubled. He sat on the edge of a garden chair, declining tea, and wrung his hands. He confessed that he felt a great weight of responsibility, as Arthur Finch had come to him only days before the murder, seeking advice on a matter of conscience involving a discovery he had made while exploring the old timber mill ruins. Finch had found a cache of old documents, but before he could explain further, they had been interrupted. The vicar feared that his failure to follow up had led to the current tragedy. Miss Marple listened intently, her head tilted like a bird's. The timber mill again. It was the common thread that kept appearing, stretching back 30 years like a fraying rope. Later that evening, Miss Marple made her way toward the manor, taking the back path that skirted the edge of the woods. She wanted to see the summer house again before the police cordons were removed. As she walked, she recalled the behaviour of Lady Ashworth's daughter, Eleanor, during the arrest. While the rest of the village had been gawking at the police car, Eleanor had been seen at the village chemist, purchasing a heavy dose of valerian for her mother's nerves. Miss Marple had noticed Eleanor's hands. They were scratched, as if she had been reaching through thick brambles or perhaps clearing away overgrown ivy from a hidden window. Reaching the summer house, Miss Marple did not look at the door. Instead, she walked around to the rear, where the ancient stone wall met the timber frame. The ivy here was thick and waxy, but several strands had been recently disturbed. Probing gently with her umbrella, she found exactly what she suspected. The lattice window wasn't just broken, it was hinged. It was a secret entrance, likely designed for Victorian lovers or surreptitious servants, and it allowed entry into the summer house from the woods without ever being seen by the gardener. On the ground beneath the window, partially obscured by a damp leaf, was a small, glittering object. Miss Marple picked it up with her handkerchief. It was a tiny, gold-plated link, the kind used to join a charm to a bracelet. She tucked the handkerchief into her sleeve, her mind working through the implications. If Arthur Finch had found documents at the mill, he might have been a witness to a secret, but he was unlikely to be the architect of the crime. The person who killed Mr. Ponsonby knew the geography of the manor, possessed family heirlooms, and was desperate to keep the year 1952 buried in the archives. As she walked home in the gathering dark, Miss Marple felt a profound sadness. The police were satisfied with their obvious suspect, but the real killer was still at large, likely sitting in a drawing room, sipping sherry and believing they had successfully redirected the storm toward a helpless young man. The following morning, the village of Hazelbrook seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, convinced that Arthur Finch's arrest had restored the natural order of things. With the criminal behind bars, the local residents returned to their mundane preoccupations, leaving the deeper shadows of the case to lengthen unnoticed. Miss Marple, however, spent her morning in a state of quiet, industrious contemplation. She was not in her garden today. Instead, she had taken up her position in the small, dusty alcove of the village lending library. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, much like the secrets she suspected were hidden within its archives. She was ostensibly searching for a book on Victorian lace patterns, but her true focus was a stack of yellowed newspapers from the autumn of 1952. While Inspector Slack was busy at the station trying to coerce a confession out of a bewildered Arthur Finch, Miss Marple was looking for a name. She remembered a specific detail from the day of the murder, not the black rose nor the body, but something far more trivial. When Lady Ashworth had first seen the photograph on the easel, she had dropped her evening bag. A few items had spilled onto the grass: a compact, a lace handkerchief, and a small ivory-handled magnifying glass. It was the magnifying glass that had caught Miss Marple's eye. It was etched with the initials M.E.L. To the casual observer, these were simply the initials of a previous owner, perhaps a distant relative. But to Miss Marple, who possessed a memory like a well-organized filing cabinet, those initials triggered a very specific recollection of a young woman named Mary Elizabeth Lowater. Mary had been a local girl, a secretary at the very timber mill that had burned down in 1952. She had vanished shortly after the fire, and it was widely assumed she had run off to London to seek a better life, leaving behind a heartbroken mother and a trail of unanswered questions. The mill fire had been ruled an accident, and the insurance payout had saved the Ashworth estate from financial ruin during a particularly lean decade. As Miss Marple turned the brittle pages of the Hazelbrook Gazette, she found the report she was looking for. There, in a small column on the third page, was a list of items lost in the fire. It mentioned a presentation desk set given to the staff. She felt a familiar prickle of intuition. If Lady Ashworth was carrying a magnifying glass that had belonged to a girl who disappeared 30 years ago, the connection between the manor and the mill fire was far more intimate than anyone dared to suggest. It was a minor, seemingly unimportant detail, the sort of thing Inspector Slack would dismiss as a mere coincidence. But in Miss Marple's experience, there were no coincidences when it came to human nature. The library door creaked open, and Miss Marple observed the entrance of Eleanor Ashworth. The younger woman looked ravaged by exhaustion, her eyes rimmed with red. She did not see Miss Marple hidden in the shadows of the history section. Eleanor went straight to the librarian's desk and asked, in a strained whisper, if the parish maps from the early 50s were available for reference. Her voice had a desperate, frantic edge to it. When told they were currently out for restoration, she let out a sharp, jagged breath that was nearly a sob, then turned and hurried out of the building. Miss Marple remained still, her finger resting on a photograph of the burning mill. She noticed something in the background of the old newsprint image, a figure standing near the tree line watching the flames. The quality was poor, but the posture was unmistakable. It was a man with a distinctive, slightly stooped shoulder, the same posture she had seen in the silver-framed photograph of Mr. Ponsonby as a young man. The solicitor had not just been the family lawyer, he had been a witness. She closed the newspaper and left the library, her mind humming with the weight of the discovery. The pieces were beginning to align, though the picture they formed was a grim one. The black rose was not a curse from a ghost, but a calling card from the past, Someone was reminding the Ashworth family of a debt that had never been paid, and Mr. Ponsonby had likely been killed because he had finally reached his limit with the deception. As she walked toward the chemist's to buy her peppermint lozenges, Miss Marple saw Dr. Albright's car parked outside the manor. The doctor was there again, supposedly to tend to Lady Ashworth's nerves. Miss Marple paused, adjusting her hat. She realized that the family album wasn't just a collection of memories, it was a ledger of crimes, and the most important page had yet to be turned. The following morning, the deceptive calm of Hazelbrook was further eroded by a series of quiet revelations that rippled through the village like stones dropped into a stagnant pond. Miss Marple, who had spent the early hours tidying her knitting basket, decided it was an appropriate time to pay a visit to Mrs. Henderson. While many in the village viewed Mrs. Henderson as a mere purveyor of idle gossip, Miss Marple knew that such women were often the unofficial archivists of human frailty. Over a plate of rather dry digestive biscuits, the conversation naturally drifted toward the tragedy at the manor. It was here that the first of the hidden resentments began to surface, revealing that the ties binding the village together were often more like nooses than safety nets. Mrs. Henderson revealed, with a significant look over her teacup, that Lady Ashworth herself 20 years ago had sponsored Dr. Albright's arrival in Hazelbrook entirely. At the time, the doctor had been a young man with a shadowed reputation and a mounting gambling debt from his university days. Lady Ashworth's patronage had bought his silence and his loyalty, turning him into a fixture of the estate's inner circle. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking a rhythmic accompaniment to the tale. It was a classic case of a kept professional. The doctor owed his very livelihood to the woman whose nerves he was now so frantically treating. If Lady Ashworth had a secret to hide, Dr. Albright was the one man who could ensure it remained buried under a medical seal of confidentiality. The talk then shifted to the schoolmistress, Miss Gregson, whose interest in the local history album had seemed more than academic. Mrs. Henderson whispered that Miss Gregson was not actually from the north, as she claimed, but was the niece of a former mill worker who had been crippled in the fire of 1952. The worker had died in poverty, having been denied any compensation due to a technicality in the insurance papers that had been drawn up by none other than Mr. Ponsonby. Suddenly the schoolmistress's presence at the fete took on a predatory quality. She wasn't just a newcomer, she was a seeker of justice, or perhaps a seeker of revenge. The motives were multiplying with every passing hour, painting a picture of a village where everyone had a reason to wish the solicitor dead. As Miss Marple walked home, she intentionally took the long route past the old timber mill ruins. Moss and ivy now softened the blackened stones, but the skeletal remains of the main office still stood as a monument to that fateful night. She found Eleanor Ashworth there, standing amidst the rubble. The younger woman didn't see Miss Marple at first. She was staring intensely at a patch of ground near the old cellar entrance. When she finally noticed the elderly lady, Eleanor jumped, her face flushing a guilty crimson. She claimed she was merely looking for historical inspiration for her mother's album, but her hands were stained with soot and earth. Miss Marple noticed that Eleanor's charm bracelet was missing a link, the very same link she had found near the summer-house window. The confrontation was subtle, as Miss Marple's confrontations always were. She spoke gently of the beauty of the ruins and the tragedy of the lives changed by the fire. She mentioned quite casually that she had been reading the old newspapers and had noticed how much the insurance payout had helped the manor during its troubled years. Eleanor's reaction was visceral, her jaw tightened, and she turned away, her voice shaking as she defended her mother's honor. She spoke of the sacrifices the family had made to keep the estate together, hinting at a burden of guilt that had been passed down like a heavy heirloom. It was clear to Miss Marple that Eleanor knew about the fire, and perhaps she knew that the fire hadn't been an accident at all. When Miss Marple returned to her own cottage, she realized that the family album curse was actually a form of psychological warfare. The black rose, the vintage photograph, and the jet pin were all intended to crack the cold, aristocratic exterior of the Ashworth family. Mr. Ponsonby had been the first to break, likely threatening to confess his role in the insurance fraud to ease his conscience in his twilight years. The real question was which of the people she had observed had the most to lose. Was it the doctor, whose career depended on the Ashworths? Was it the schoolmistress seeking a blood debt for her family? Or was it the daughter, Eleanor, who would do anything to protect her mother from the scandal that 1952 represented? As the evening light faded, Miss Marple sat in her wing-back chair, realizing that the most dangerous secrets are those that people have convinced themselves were for a good cause. The following afternoon, just as the village seemed to be settling into the comfortable narrative of Arthur Finch's guilt, a second shockwave rippled through Hazelbrook. It began when the postman, making his late-round deliveries, noticed that the front door to the schoolhouse was standing wide open, swinging rhythmically in the damp breeze. Inside, the small living quarters of Miss Gregson were in a state of calculated chaos. Drawers had been pulled out, books were strewn across the floor, and a heavy scent of lavender water, the very brand Miss Marple had admired at the chemist's, clung to the air. Miss Gregson herself was nowhere to be found, but on the mahogany writing desk lay a single chilling object, a second withered black rose, identical to the one found at the summer house. This new development threw Inspector Slack into a frenzy of redirected activity. He immediately assumed that Miss Gregson had fled, perhaps fearing that her connection to the mill worker would be discovered. To the official mind this was a clear admission of complicity. He now theorized that the schoolmistress and Arthur Finch had been working in tandem to extort the Ashworths. However, Miss Marple, standing on the periphery of the growing crowd outside the schoolhouse, noticed a detail that Slack completely overlooked. Amidst the scattered papers on the floor was a small, torn fragment of a parish record, specifically a baptismal entry from the summer of 1953. It wasn't the theft that interested Miss Marple, but the fact that the thief had been searching for something specific and had been interrupted before they could destroy the evidence. The disappearance of the schoolmistress shifted the village's suspicion toward a darker, more complex conspiracy. Rumours began to circulate that Miss Gregson hadn't fled at all, but had been silenced by the same forces that had claimed Mr. Ponsonby. Miss Marple decided it was time to visit the manor once more, not as a guest, but as an observer of the cracks appearing in the Ashworth facade. She found the house in a state of suppressed panic. Lady Ashworth had retreated to her darkened bedroom, refusing to see anyone but Dr. Albright. Eleanor was pacing the long gallery, her eyes hollow and her movements erratic. When she saw Miss Marple, she didn't offer the usual polite greetings. Instead, she cornered the elderly woman near a display of Ming vases. Eleanor's voice was a harsh whisper as she spoke of the letters. She revealed that for the past month her mother had been receiving anonymous notes containing nothing but dates that corresponded to the 1952 fire and the subsequent insurance hearings. The notes had stopped the day Mr. Ponsonby died, only to be replaced by the photograph at the fete. Eleanor confessed she had gone to the mill ruins to find the cache Arthur Finch had mentioned to the vicar, fearing it contained proof that the fire had been arson. She admitted to finding the secret entrance to the summer house weeks ago, using it to spy on Mr. Ponsonby during his private meetings with her mother. She had been desperate to know the truth, but she swore she had found him already dead when she reached the summer house windows that afternoon. This revelation changed the geometry of the mystery entirely. If Eleanor had been at the window, she might have seen the killer, or perhaps she was the killer trying to weave a new layer of deception. Miss Marple listened with a sympathetic expression, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the lavender water she had smelled in the schoolhouse. It was a distinctive, old-fashioned scent, favoured by a generation that was rapidly disappearing. It wasn't the scent Miss Gregson wore. The schoolmistress favoured something more modern and floral. It was, however, the exact scent used by the manor's housekeeper, Mrs. Pike, who had been with the family since before the war. The twist was not just the disappearance of the schoolmistress, but the realization that the past was not being unearthed by an outsider, but was being defended from within. The black rose at the schoolhouse wasn't a threat to Miss Gregson, it was a plant, a piece of stagecraft designed to make her look like the culprit. The true killer was now moving to eliminate anyone who possessed the documents Finch had discovered. Miss Marple realized that the schoolmistress's life was in grave danger, and the key lay in the parish record she had seen on the floor. It wasn't about the fire itself, but about a child born in the aftermath, a child whose existence would change the line of succession for the Ashworth estate. As the sun set, casting a bloody hue over the manor's stone walls, Miss Marple knew she had to act before the true killer finished cleaning up the village's history. The evening air in Hazelbrook had grown thick with a damp, clinging chill that seemed to seep through the very stones of the village. Miss Marple, however, appeared quite unaffected as she made her way toward the vicarage, carrying a small basket of her homemade damson jam. She knew that the vicar's study was the heart of the village's paper trail, and it was there she intended to set her trap. She found the vicar in a state of high agitation, his desk buried under a mountain of old registers. He was, as she expected, trying to make sense of the very same baptismal records she had seen a fragment of in the schoolhouse. It was a scene of scholarly chaos that provided the perfect cover for a gentle interrogation. With a soft cough, Miss Marple settled into the chintz armchair opposite him. She began to speak of the family album, but not as a collection of photographs. Instead, she spoke of it as a ledger of human error. She mentioned how remarkable it was that so many lives were intertwined by the events of 1952, comparing it to the time the local postmaster had accidentally swapped the mail for the entire parish. "See, Vicar," she said, her needles beginning their hypnotic click-clack, "people often think they can bury the past under a new coat of paint, but the original color always bleeds through eventually, especially when someone has gone to such lengths to keep a specific name hidden." She watched him closely as she mentioned the name Mary Elizabeth Lowater. The vicar's hand hesitated over a ledger, a minute tremor visible in his fingers. He confessed that he had found a curious discrepancy in the records from the year following the fire. There was an entry for a child, a girl, whose parentage had been partially obscured by a heavy ink blot, an ink blot that looked remarkably deliberate. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild maternal interest. "Like a smudge on a window pane," she murmured. "It doesn't hide the view, it only makes one wonder what is being concealed." It was at this moment that Dr. Albright arrived ostensibly to deliver a tonic for the vicar's recurring indigestion. The timing was too convenient to be accidental. Miss Marple decided to expand her game. She turned her mild blue gaze upon the doctor, noting the way his eyes darted toward the open ledgers on the desk. She began to talk about the jet hatpin she had found, describing it in minute detail. She mentioned that such pins were often sold in pairs, and that it was a pity the second one had never been found. "I suppose," she mused, "the other pin must be somewhere very safe, perhaps in a medical bag or a locked drawer, where one keeps things that are too dangerous to throw away." The reaction was subtle, yet to Miss Marple's trained eye it was as loud as a shout. Dr. Albright's face did not pale, instead it flushed a deep, angry red. He adjusted his glasses with a sharp, jerky movement, and began a rambling defence of Lady Ashworth's privacy, accusing the village of morbid curiosity. He spoke with a professional arrogance that failed to mask a deep, underlying panic. Miss Marple merely smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to infuriate him further. She had poked the hornet's nest, and now she only had to wait for the occupant to reveal its sting. "It is a funny thing about human nature, Doctor," she continued, her voice as smooth as cream. "When people are frightened, they tend to repeat their patterns, like old Mrs. Bantry, who always hid her silver in the flower bin whenever a stranger came to the door. She thought she was being clever, but of course the flower always left a trail on the carpet." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. The person who killed Mr. Ponsonby and took Miss Gregson is currently leaving a very clear trail. They believe they are protecting a legacy, but they are actually just adding more pages to a very dark album. Dr. Albright made a hasty exit, his footsteps echoing sharply on the gravel path outside. The vicar looked bewildered, but Miss Marple felt a sense of grim satisfaction. She had watched the doctor's hands. When she had mentioned the second hatpin, his fingers had instinctively brushed against the pocket of his waistcoat, the very place one might keep a small, sharp object for quick access. She knew now that the doctor wasn't just Lady Ashworth's protector, he was the primary architect of the current deception. He was the one who had the medical knowledge to make a murder look like a stroke, and the social standing to move through the village unchallenged. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple declined the vicar's offer of an escort. She had one more stop. She knew where the second hatpin was, and she knew exactly where the schoolmistress was being held. The game was reaching its final stage, and the family album was about to be closed for good. The killer had been provoked into a desperate move, and in the world of Miss Marple, desperation was the most revealing clue of all. She stepped out into the night, her mind already composing the final explanation she would deliver to Inspector Slack. The gathering in the library of Hazelbrook Manor was not the celebratory event Lady Ashworth had envisioned for her historical album. Instead, the room was heavy with the scent of old paper and the sharp clinical aroma of smelling salts. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace, looking thoroughly disgruntled at being summoned by an elderly lady, while Eleanor Ashworth sat huddled in a wing-back chair. Dr. Albright stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the encroaching night, his hand resting nervously in his waistcoat pocket. Miss Marple, seated composedly with her knitting, looked up as the door opened to reveal a dishevelled but safe Miss Gregson, escorted by a junior constable. "I believe it is time we turned the final page of the Hazelbrook album," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle yet carrying an unmistakable authority. She looked directly at Dr. Albright, who didn't move. "It has been a very sad business, primarily because it was so entirely unnecessary. You see, Inspector, Mr. Ponsonby's murder was not about a curse or a random theft. It was a very old debt and a very modern fear. The story begins in 1952 with the fire at the timber mill. We all believed it was an accident that saved this estate, but it was actually a deliberate act of arson committed by a young and desperate solicitor named Ponsonby to help the Ashworth family. But there was a witness, a young secretary named Mary Elizabeth Lowater." Miss Marple paused, her needles clicking softly. Mary didn't run away to London. She was silenced, but not in the way one might think. She was paid and sent away because she was pregnant. The child she bore was the true heir to a portion of this estate, a fact that would have bankrupted the Ashworths had it ever come to light. Mr. Ponsonby kept the secret for 30 years, but as he grew older, his conscience began to trouble him. He recently contacted the daughter of that union, the young woman we know as Miss Gregson. He intended to make amends, to give her the documents Arthur Finch eventually found in the mill ruins, but he made the mistake of confiding his plan to the one man who had as much to lose as the Ashworths, his own doctor. Inspector Slack shifted his weight, his eyes darting between Miss Marple and Albright. "The doctor? Why him?" Miss Marple sighed. "Because Dr. Albright's entire career was built on Lady Ashworth's hush money. He wasn't just a physician, he was the keeper of the family's darkest secrets. If the estate fell or the scandal broke, his comfortable life would vanish. When Mr. Ponsonby met with the doctor to discuss his failing heart, he was actually seeking a way to confess. Dr. Albright realized the solicitor was a liability. On the day of the fete, he slipped into the summer house through the hidden lattice window, the one Eleanor has been so worried about, and administered a fast-acting, undetectable digitalis derivative into Mr. Ponsonby's lemonade. He then used the black rose and the vintage photograph, items he had stolen from the manor's attic weeks prior, to create the illusion of a local vendetta. Dr. Albright took a step forward, his face contorted. "This is preposterous. You have no proof of such a wild tale." Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and pulled out a small, clear lace handkerchief. Inside lay a single, jet-headed hatpin. "This is the second pin, Doctor. I found it in your medical bag when you left it in the vicar's hallway during your tonic delivery. But more importantly, Inspector, if you look at the doctor's left hand, you will see a very specific scratch. It was made by the schoolhouse door latch when he forced Miss Gregson into his car to hide her in the old mill cellar. He couldn't kill her yet. He needed to find the documents first. He planted the rose in her room to frame her and Arthur Finch, a classic redirection I've seen many times, most notably with the village blacksmith in St. Mary Mead back in 29. The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Albright's hand moved toward his pocket, but the constable was faster, pinning his arms behind his back. As they moved him toward the door, the doctor's professional mask finally shattered, leaving behind a man hollowed out by his own greed. Miss Marple watched him go with a look of profound sadness. She turned to Eleanor and the trembling Miss Gregson. "The truth is often like a perennial, my dears," she said softly. "You can cut it back, you can even try to weed it out, but it always finds a way to the surface in the end. It is simply a matter of human nature." By the following Monday, the heavy oppressive mist that had settled over Hazelbrook seemed to have lifted, replaced by a crisp, clarifying breeze that rattled the remaining rose petals in the manor gardens. The police cars had long since departed, taking with them the disgraced Dr. Albright and a mountain of confiscated ledgers. Arthur Finch had been released with a formal apology that he received with a bewildered sort of grace, though the village gossips were already busy pivoting their narratives to claim they had known of his innocence all along. The village hall, once a site of interrogation and dread, was being prepared for the weekly bridge club, as if the local inhabitants were collectively trying to scrub the memory of the murder from their domestic routines. Miss Marple sat in her own small sunroom, the rhythmic clicking of her knitting needles providing a steady, comforting pulse to the morning. She was working on a soft blue cardigan for a grandniece, her mind occasionally drifting back to the events at the manor. She watched through the window as the postman made his rounds, noticing how he lingered a bit longer at each gate, no doubt sharing the latest filtered details of the doctor's downfall. It was a human instinct, she mused, to turn tragedy into a story. It made the darkness manageable and the neighbours seem less like strangers. Lady Ashworth had retreated into a dignified seclusion, though it was whispered that she had made a private financial settlement with Miss Gregson. The schoolmistress had returned to her duties, though she now walked with a certain quiet confidence that had been absent before. The family album itself had been shelved, its pages a reminder of a past that was no longer a secret to be guarded with blood. Miss Marple understood that while the legal justice had been served, Hazelbrook's social fabric would take much longer to mend. Secrets, once aired, have a way of leaving a permanent scent behind, much like the lingering aroma of the lavender water that had helped betray the housekeeper's early complicity in hiding the doctor's movements. Later that afternoon, the vicar dropped by for a moment of quiet reflection and a cup of tea. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deepened by the realization that he had lived alongside such deceit for decades without perceiving it. He asked Miss Marple, with a touch of genuine humility, how she had managed to see through the curse when everyone else was so blinded by the theatricality of the black rose. Miss Marple poured the tea with a steady hand, her expression one of mild maternal patience. She explained that she hadn't looked at the rose at all, but rather at the people reacting to it. In her experience, the more elaborate the stage dressing, the more desperate the actor is to hide their true face. "It is a very sad fact, Vicar," she said softly, "that people will do almost anything to protect their image of themselves." Doctor. Albright didn't kill for money, in the simplest sense. He killed to protect the version of himself that the village respected. He had become so accustomed to being the good doctor that he couldn't bear the thought of being the beneficiary of arson. It is a form of vanity that often leads to the most ruthless of actions. She watched a robin hop across the grass, its bright eye fixed on a potential meal. Nature, she thought, was far more honest about its motives than humanity ever managed to be. As the sun began to dip behind the thatched roofs of the village, casting long, peaceful shadows across the lane, Miss Marple felt a sense of quiet closure. The family album curse was over, replaced by the mundane reality of a trial and the inevitable shifting of local power. Hazelbrook would return to its prize-winning dahlias and its minor social squabbles, and the name of Mr. Ponsonby would eventually fade into the local history books as a man of unfortunate health. She tucked her knitting into its bag, adjusted her shawl, and prepared for the evening chill. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that truth, however buried, always found its way to the light, usually with the help of someone who understood that the most extraordinary crimes are almost always committed by the most ordinary of people. She blew the lamp, leaving the room in a gentle, honest darkness,